In September 1947, the Johnson County Sheriff's Department in Tennessee received a call from a mailman who hadn't seen the Hafford family in 3 weeks. When deputies arrived at the isolated mountain property, they found something in the root cellar that would haunt investigators for decades. This discovery would lead to one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in Appalachian history, and the perpetrators have never been found. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about human nature and the darkest corners of history, click the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, let's continue with the story, the call. The call came into the Johnson County Sheriff's Office on Thursday morning, September 25, 1947. Route carrier Willis Pritchett had driven his postal truck up the winding mountain road to the Hafford place 3 times over the previous weeks. Each time, he'd found the mailbox overflowing with uncollected letters and parcels. The accumulation troubled him. The Haffords were reliable people, known throughout the eastern Tennessee highlands as steady farmers, who kept to themselves, but maintained their property with quiet pride. They weren't the type to simply abandon their home without word to anyone. Deputy Sheriff Raymond Cobb took the initial report. According to records that still exist in the state archives, Pritchett mentioned other troubling signs. The Haffords' dairy cows had been bellowing for days, their desperate cries echoing across the hollow. Chickens had escaped their co-op and scattered into the woods. Most disturbing was the silence. The Hafford farm, usually alive with the sounds of work and daily routine, had gone completely quiet, except for those anguished animals. Sheriff Buck Nestor organized a small party that afternoon. He brought deputies Cobb and Ernest Whitley, along with 2 volunteers from the fire department who knew the mountain roads. The drive up to the Hafford property took nearly an hour, following a rutted dirt track that climbed steadily into the dense hardwood forests of the Appalachian Ridge. The property sat in a natural bowl surrounded by steep wooded slopes, invisible from any neighboring homestead. In that landscape of profound isolation, a family could vanish and no one would hear them scream. The discovery. When the sheriff's party arrived, they found the front door to the farmhouse standing open. Inside, the scene suggested interrupted life rather than planned departure. A pot of beans sat on the cold stove, the contents long since spoiled and covered in mold. Plates had been set on the kitchen table for supper, 4 places arranged with careful domesticity. Flies swarmed in the September heat. In the main bedroom, dresser drawers hung open with clothing spilling out, as though someone had searched through them in haste or panic. But what caught Sheriff Nestor's attention was the dirt outside the back door. Deep grooves in the earth, drag marks leading away from the house toward the tree line, and something else, barefoot prints in the dried mud. Small and narrow. Sheriff Nestor ordered his men to search the outbuildings first. The barn revealed nothing except starving livestock and scattered tools. The smokehouse stood empty, its hooks bare and rusted. But when Deputy Cobb approached the root cellar, built into the hillside behind the main house, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Fresh lumber had been nailed across the door from the outside, the boards still showing pale wood where the bark had been stripped away. Someone had sealed it recently, perhaps within the last few weeks. The deputies pried the boards loose with crowbars, the nails shrieking as they pulled free from the frame. The moment the door swung open, the smell hit them like a physical blow. Deputy Whitley turned and vomited into the weeds. Sheriff Nestor pulled a handkerchief over his nose and mouth, then descended the stone steps into the darkness with his flashlight cutting through the fetid air. What the beam revealed would be documented in the county coroner's report filed 3 days later. A report that still exists in the Tennessee State Archives in Nashville. The root cellar. The root cellar, normally used for storing preserved vegetables and cured meat through the winter months, had been transformed into something else entirely. Human remains lay scattered across the earthen floor in various stages of decomposition. The coroner, Dr. Harold Varms, would later count parts belonging to at least 5 individuals. Though the condition of the remains made precise identification nearly impossible with the forensic capabilities of 1947, the bodies had been dismembered with what Dr. Vance described in his report as surprising anatomical knowledge. Joints had been separated cleanly. Major bones cracked open in ways suggesting deliberate access to the marrow within. Some remains showed evidence of preservation attempts, packed in salt and wrapped in burlap, stored on shelves like provisions for a long winter. Other parts appeared to have been discarded carelessly, tossed into corners where rats had been at them. Dr. Vance's report noted scoring patterns consistent with knife work, but also something else. Tooth marks. Human tooth marks visible on several of the larger bones where the meat had been stripped away. The coroner, a veteran of the First World War who had seen his share of horror in the field hospitals of France, wrote in his official conclusion that the evidence suggested systematic butchering and consumption of human flesh over an extended period. But the mathematics of the scene troubled Sheriff Nestor immediately. The Havford family consisted of 4 people: Samuel Havford, his wife Martha, and their 2 teenage sons, Jacob and Luke. Yet the remains in the cellar belonged to 5 individuals, at minimum, possibly more. The bodies were too degraded for visual identification, and dental records for rural mountain families simply didn't exist in that era. However, certain observations could be made. One victim had been a large man, over 6 feet tall based on femur measurements. Another had been small, possibly a woman or adolescent. As evening approached and volunteer fire department members helped remove the remains for transport to the county morgue, Sheriff Nestor stood in the yard and studied those barefoot prints again. They led from the cellar area toward the forest, overlapping the drag marks but heading in the opposite direction. Whoever made those prints had walked away from this place after the horror inside had been completed, and they had walked toward the wilderness, where the mountains stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, vast and indifferent to human law. The investigation sheriff Nestor began his investigation with the history of the property and its inhabitants. The county clerk's records revealed that the Havford farm had belonged to the family since 1883, passed down through 3 generations. Samuel Havford had inherited it from his father in 1936, but buried in those same records was something unexpected. Samuel had 2 sisters considerably older than him who had lived on the property until the early 1940s. Their names were Ulla and Dovie Havford. According to marriage licenses on file, both sisters had married local men in quick succession during the summer of 1941. Ulla wed a widower named Gideon Fry in June of that year. Dovie married a logger called Silas Hatcher just 3 weeks later in July. The licenses listed the Havford farm as the sisters' residence, but no forwarding addresses appeared in any subsequent records. The sisters had simply vanished from all official documentation after those marriages, as though they had stepped off the edge of the world. Sheriff Nestor drove to the homes of several elderly residents who had lived in the area for decades. What he heard from them painted a picture far different from the tidy narrative suggested by marriage certificates and property deeds. Ida Sutherland, a woman of 73 who ran a small store at the crossroads, remembered the Havford sisters with visible discomfort. She described them as strange from childhood, wild creatures who rarely came down from the mountain. When they did appear, usually to collect supplies their father had ordered, they moved with an odd gait and avoided meeting anyone's eyes. More troubling were the memories shared by Cecil Drummond, a farmer who had attended school with Samuel Havford in the 1920s. He recalled that Ulla and Dovie had been pulled from the schoolhouse when they were around 10 and 12 years old. The official reason given was that they were needed for farm work, but Cecil remembered darker rumours. The girls had become violent in class, attacking other children without provocation. One incident involved Dovie biting a classmate's arm hard enough to draw blood. After their removal from school, Cecil said, no one really saw the sisters anymore. They became ghosts on their own property. The most significant information came from a retired postal carrier named Vernon Hayes, who had worked the mountain routes in the early 1940s. He remembered delivering mail to the Havford farm and occasionally glimpsing the sisters through windows or around the barn. Neither Gideon Fry nor Silas Hatcher, the men who supposedly married the Havford sisters, were ever seen again after those summer weddings in 1941. Vernon had delivered mail to both men's residences before the marriages, but afterward their homes sat empty and eventually fell into disrepair. The Patton Sheriff Nestor returned to his office and pulled the missing persons reports for Johnson County spanning the previous decade. 2 names appeared that matched the abandoned husbands. Gideon Fry's adult daughter had filed a report in October 1941, stating her father had vanished after his marriage. Silas Hatcher's employer at the lumber mill had filed a similar report in August of the same year. Both investigations had gone nowhere. The men assumed to have simply moved away with their new wives. No one had thought to question whether the couples actually left together or whether the brides had returned to the mountain alone. With the possibility of the sisters' involvement now under serious consideration, Sheriff Nestor expanded his search through the archives. He spent 3 days in the basement of the county courthouse, pulling every missing persons report filed since 1941. What emerged was a pattern so clear that its previous invisibility seemed almost deliberate. 7 people had disappeared in the Johnson County Highlands over 6 years, and every single one had last been seen traveling toward or near the Havford property. The first was a traveling salesman named Arthur Pettigrew, who sold household goods from the back of his truck. In April 1942, his employer in Knoxville reported him missing after he failed to return from his mountain route. His truck was found abandoned on a logging road 3 miles from the Havford farm, its inventory intact, but Pettigrew nowhere to be found. In August 1943, a federal census taker named Dorothy Marsh disappeared while conducting the agricultural census in the remote mountain districts. Her supervisor's report noted that her last scheduled stop was the Havford property. When she failed to return to her boarding house that evening, a search party found her automobile parked at the bottom of the mountain road, her census materials still in the front seat. 2 distant cousins of the Havford family, visiting from Virginia in the spring of 1944, never returned home. According to their travel plans, they were going to stay at the Havford farm for several days to discuss the possible sale of some timber rights. Samuel Havford, when questioned at the time, claimed the cousins had never arrived. The pattern continued with grim regularity. A young surveyor working for the State Highway Department in 1945, a herbalist woman who gathered medicinal plants in the high country in 1946. All of them last seen in the vicinity of the Havford property, all of them vanished without a trace. What made Sheriff Nestor's blood run cold was discovering mentions of the Havford sisters in witness statements he'd initially overlooked. The highway surveyor's assistant remembered seeing 2 women in ragged clothing watching them from the tree line above the Havford farm. The herbalist had told her daughter about encountering 2 strange women in the forest who had followed her for nearly a mile before disappearing into the laurel thicket. The locals had a name for Ula and Dovey One that Sheriff Nestor heard repeated in hushed conversations. They called them the Wild Havford Girls. People spoke of them the way they might speak of dangerous animals, creatures to be avoided rather than confronted. And for 6 years, those creatures had been hunting the wilderness camp. 30 volunteers from neighboring counties joined his deputies, along with 4 bloodhounds borrowed from the state penitentiary. The dogs picked up a scent trail immediately, following those barefoot prints into the dense woods. The trail led upward through increasingly difficult terrain, over ridges choked with mountain laurel, and through ravines where cold springs bubbled from the rock. The hounds had found something approximately 3 miles northeast of the Havford farm, in a natural hollow sheltered by a semicircle of limestone cliffs that kept it hidden from any casual observer. What the search party discovered there would be documented in dozens of photographs that still exist in the case files. Someone had been living in this place for years, perhaps since the early 1940s, based on the weathering of the structures. Crude lean-tos had been constructed from fallen branches and bark, reinforced with stolen canvas tarps that showed manufacturer labels from the wartime period. Inside these shelters, the searchers found clothing that clearly didn't belong to the sisters. Men's work shirts and trousers, a woman's dress, items that matched descriptions from several of the missing persons reports. The encampment centered around 3 fire pits, their stones blackened from countless blazes. Around these pits lay scattered bones in quantities that suggested years of accumulation. Deputy Cobb, who had worked in a butcher shop before joining the sheriff's department, examined them carefully. Some were clearly animal deer and wild pig and smaller game, but others made him call for Sheriff Nestor immediately. The bones showed the same knife scoring and tooth marks they'd seen in the root cellar, and several were unmistakably human. A skull, partially crushed, rested against the base of one of the limestone cliffs. Femurs and ribs lay in the cold ash of the fire pits. Dr. Vance arrived the following morning to examine the site. His supplementary report noted that the bones appeared to have been cracked open for their marrow, then discarded. Some showed evidence of having been roasted directly over open flames. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from Deputy Whitley, who found a cache hidden beneath one of the lean-tos. Wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the weather were personal effects that had clearly been taken as trophies. A pocket watch engraved with initials that matched the missing salesman, a woman's wedding ring that Dorothy Marsh's sister would later identify, identification papers for the Virginia cousins. Each item represented a life taken, a person who had walked into these mountains and never returned. The sisters had lived here like predatory animals, emerging only to hunt when hunger or opportunity presented itself. And somewhere in this vast wilderness, they were still out there, watching from the ridges as the searchers combed through the evidence of their crimes. The witness news of the discoveries spread through the mountain communities like wildfire, and with it came something Sheriff Nestor had desperately needed. Witnesses began to come forward. The most significant testimony came from a circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Caldwell, who arrived at the sheriff's office on October 8th with a story that had been haunting him for over a year. In late June 1946, Reverend Caldwell had been traveling his usual route through the Highland settlements, bringing Sunday services to families too isolated to attend regular churches. The Havford farm had been on his circuit for years, and Samuel had always welcomed him, offering a meal and a place to sleep. On this particular visit, Caldwell arrived just as the sun was setting. His written statement described the evening in careful detail. Martha Havford had seemed nervous during supper, constantly glancing toward the windows. Samuel had been unusually quiet, barely touching his food. The two sons sat rigid in their chairs, their eyes fixed on their plates as though afraid to look up. After dark, as the family prepared for bed, Caldwell heard movement outside. Through the kitchen window, he witnessed something that made his hands shake even a year later as he recounted it. Two figures emerged from the tree line, moving with a strange, loping gait that seemed more animal than human. They were women, or had been once, but they looked like creatures from a nightmare. Their hair hung in matted tangles past their waists. Their clothing consisted of filthy rags that might have once been dresses. Their feet were bare and black with dirt. Samuel had gone outside immediately, carrying a basket of food scraps and what looked like raw meat from the smokehouse. The two women fell upon it without using their hands, tearing at the food with their teeth, making sounds the Reverend described as growls and whimpers. They communicated with each other in a series of grunts and strange syllables that bore no resemblance to any language Caldwell had ever heard. Samuel stood watching them eat, his shoulders slumped in what looked like defeat or resignation. When Caldwell had asked Martha who those women were, she'd gone pale and told him they were Samuel's sisters, that they were sick in the head and the family was caring for them the best they could. She begged him not to speak of it to anyone, claiming the sisters would be taken away and locked in an asylum where they'd surely die. The Reverend, moved by what he thought was Christian charity toward the afflicted, had agreed to keep silent. But that night, unable to sleep, he'd heard the sisters circling the house for hours, their footsteps on the porch, their hands scratching at the doors and windows like dogs wanting in. In the morning, he'd left before sunrise and never returned to the Havford farm. Now, hearing of the murders, he understood that what he'd witnessed wasn't compassion, but captivity. The Havford family had been prisoners on their own land, feeding predators to keep themselves alive. The Psychological Assessment Sheriff Nestor contacted the State Mental Health Board in Nashville, requesting expert consultation. Dr. Philip Hargrove, a psychiatrist who had worked with severely disturbed patients at the state hospital, traveled to Johnson County to review the case files. His assessment, completed in mid-October and preserved in the investigative records, painted a portrait of systematic abuse and complete psychological disintegration. Through interviews with the oldest residents of the area, Hargrove pieced together fragments of their early years. Their mother had died in childbirth when Dovie was born, leaving their father, Ezekiel Havford, to raise 3 children alone in almost complete isolation. Neighbors recalled that Ezekiel was a brutal man who viewed his daughters not as children but as burdens. Multiple witnesses remembered seeing the girls only rarely after their removal from school. When they did appear, they bore marks of physical abuse. But the treatment apparently went beyond ordinary cruelty. Cecil Drummond revealed something he'd kept silent for decades. During the final weeks before the girls were withdrawn from school, he'd seen Ezekiel drag them both from the schoolhouse by their hair, screaming that they were devil spawn who'd killed their mother. He'd thrown them into the back of his wagon like sacks of grain and driven away. What happened after that could only be inferred from physical evidence. The locked outbuilding that several neighbors mentioned stood about 50 yards behind the main house, a windowless structure barely large enough to hold 2 people. Inside, investigators found chains bolted to the walls and a dirt floor stained with substances that suggested years of habitation in the most degrading conditions imaginable. This was where Ezekiel had apparently kept his daughters for nearly 2 decades, feeding them scraps, treating them as something less than human. Dr. Hargrove's report theorized that prolonged isolation during crucial developmental years, combined with severe abuse and malnutrition, had prevented the sisters from developing normal cognitive and social abilities. They would have regressed to a primitive state, losing language and adopting survival behaviors more consistent with feral animals than human beings. Records showed that Ezekiel Havford died in 1936, the same year Samuel inherited the property. At that point, Ula would have been approximately 38 years old, Dovie around 36. When Samuel discovered them, he'd apparently been unable or unwilling to seek proper help. Instead, he'd attempted to maintain control through feeding and appeasement, a strategy that worked only until it didn't. The question that haunted Dr. Hargrove's conclusion was this: at what point had the sisters stopped being victims and become predators? When had learned violence transformed into hunger? His report offered no answer. The manhunt. On October 15, 1947, Sheriff Nestor launched what newspapers would call the largest manhunt in Tennessee history. Over 200 volunteers assembled at the Havford farm at dawn, joined by deputies from 5 surrounding counties and a contingent of state police. Somewhere in the vast Appalachian wilderness, 2 women who had killed at least a dozen people were still at large. The bloodhounds started tracking from the wilderness encampment, following scent trails that led deeper into the mountains. The search parties moved in coordinated lines, sweeping through terrain that grew increasingly hostile with each mile. On the second day, the dogs led searchers to another site, 15 miles northeast of the original camp. This location showed signs of recent occupation. A fire pit still contained warm ashes. Fresh deer bones lay scattered nearby, the meat stripped away within the last 24 hours. Whoever had been here had fled just ahead of the pursuit, moving with a speed and knowledge of the terrain that made tracking them nearly impossible. By the fourth day, the bloodhounds had led the search party across the state line into North Carolina. The trail wound through a series of ridges and valleys so remote that even experienced hunters rarely ventured there. That afternoon, near a place called Devil's Creek, the lead hound suddenly stopped and refused to continue, whining and backing away from a narrow gap between two rock faces. Deputy Whitley volunteered to investigate, crawling through the gap into a small cave beyond. His flashlight revealed recent signs of habitation, but nothing more. The sisters had been there, probably within the last few hours, but they'd vanished again into the endless forest. The scent trail simply ended at that point. On the 8th day of the search, a shepherd named Amos Kirby reported an encounter that would become the last confirmed sighting. While tending his flock on a high meadow near the North Carolina border, he'd looked up to see two figures standing on a distant ridgeline, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. They stood absolutely still, watching him with what he described as unnatural focus. When he raised his hand to wave, thinking they might be lost hikers, both figures dropped to all fours and vanished over the ridge with a speed that left him shaken. The search continued for another week, but the trail had gone cold. The official search was called off on November 2, 1947, but the hunt for Ula and Dovey Halford never truly ended. The decades after over, the following decades, reports trickled in from the most isolated corners of the southern Appalachians, each one impossible to verify, yet disturbing enough to keep the case file active well into the 1970s. In the winter of 1948, a trapper working the high country near the Tennessee-North Carolina border found a remote cabin that had been broken into. Canned goods had been opened and consumed, but nothing else had been taken. Most unsettling were the muddy footprints throughout the interior, small and bare, despite the freezing temperatures outside. 3 years later, in August 1951, a family camping in the Cherokee National Forest reported seeing two wild-looking women observing them from across a ravine. The father insisted the women weren't hikers. They wore rags that barely constituted clothing and moved through the underbrush with unnatural fluidity. When he called out to them, they fled into the forest with startling speed. The pattern continued through the decades. In 1958, a hunter in western North Carolina came across the partially consumed carcass of a black bear, the meat torn away in ways that suggested human teeth rather than another predator. Livestock disappearances in remote areas of eastern Tennessee occurred with suspicious regularity, the animals killed and butchered with crude efficiency. Law enforcement opinions divided sharply on what had become of the sisters. Sheriff Nestor, who retired in 1956 without ever solving the case, believed they had died during that first winter. He pointed out that no confirmed sightings occurred after 1953, suggesting whatever had been out there had finally succumbed to the elements. Others disagreed. A young deputy named Richard Voss, who joined the Johnson County Department in 1962, made the Hadford case his personal obsession. He compiled every reported sighting and plotted them on a map. The pattern he found showed a rough circular territory spanning 3 states, approximately 200 square miles of the most inaccessible terrain in the eastern United States. In 1968, Voss convinced the state police to authorize one final search using modern techniques. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the wilderness for weeks. They found abandoned camps, signs of long-term habitation in caves and rock shelters, and bones, both animal and human, scattered in remote hollows. The unanswered questions. The file sits in the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation archives, one of the oldest active cases in state history. The property itself tells part of the story. After the murders, no heir came forward to claim the farm. It sat abandoned for decades, slowly collapsing under the weight of time and weather. In 1983, the federal government absorbed the property into the Cherokee National Forest, and what remained of the buildings was demolished for safety reasons. Today, hikers occasionally stumble across the old foundation stones, never knowing the horror that once unfolded there. In 2006, a team of forensic archaeologists petitioned to excavate the site using ground-penetrating radar. The technology revealed anomalies consistent with human burial in at least 4 locations around the former property sites that had never been investigated during the original case. Budget constraints prevented full excavation, but soil samples from test holes confirmed the presence of human remains at depths suggesting burial in the 1940s. The victims discovered in 1947 represented only a fraction of the true death toll. Modern psychological analysis of the case focuses on questions that 1940s psychiatry couldn't address. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist who studied the Hadford file in 2015, noted that the sisters displayed characteristics consistent with reactive attachment disorder combined with extreme developmental trauma. Their transformation into predators represented not inherent evil, but the complete destruction of their humanity through sustained abuse during critical developmental periods. They had been made into monsters, not born as them. Yet this understanding brings no comfort to the families of the victims, many of whom still seek answers their grandparents never received. Two figures moving through the trees at twilight. Strange sounds in the night that might be communication between feral things. Most of these reports are dismissed, the products of imagination or misidentified wildlife. But sometimes experienced rangers and hunters encounter something that defies easy explanation. A camp disturbed in ways that suggest human intelligence but animal behavior. And always the feeling of being watched from the shadows just beyond the firelight. The final truth may never emerge from those mountains. If Ula and Dovie Hadford survived into old age, they would have died decades ago, their bodies claimed by the wilderness that both sheltered and concealed them. Or perhaps something of them persists still, a legacy passed down in ways we cannot comprehend, living in the deepest hollows where civilization has never penetrated and never will. If this story has disturbed you the way it should, if it's made you question how thin the line between human and animal truly is, click the like button and subscribe. These aren't just tales meant to frighten, but real histories that reveal uncomfortable truths about what we're capable of becoming. More stories that will challenge everything you think you know are coming.